Welcome to another Cafecito conversation. And this is an opportunity for me to talk to a dear friend and colleague in our virtual coffee house. And today I'm just so happy because I'm with Dr. Carmen Varela. Carmen is the director of the Office of Accessibility and Disability Resources. And today we're just going to have a conversation. And so, Carmen, welcome to our cafecito. We have our cafecitos ready to go here.
Thanks, Richard. Happy to be here.
Oh, wonderful. And Carmen, I know there's a special little story behind your mug. Tell me a little bit about the recuerdo.
Thank you. So this is my favorite coffee mug. It belonged to my mother, who was born in Durango, Mexico. And so I found this in my childhood home. And it says Recuerdos de Durango, and it's extra special, not just because it's from Durango, but because it was my mother's, and my mother passed away in May of last year. So it's become my very favorite cup, and it makes me feel close to her.
Well, we are remembering your mom, and your mom lives on through you. So what a beautiful memory that is.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to use her memory as a transition into our first question, because we're now sitting in our virtual coffee house, and I've been thinking a lot about this in my memories lately of my own reflection on being Latino or Latinx, now they call me. And so I wanted to just get your, first of all, impression about your memories about being a Latinx woman, but also kind of the transitions we've been through. As I think back on my life, Mexican, I've had different labels, right? Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, Hispanic, Latino, now Latinx. And every time that kind of has shifted, sometimes perceptions have changed, but then sometimes it's just a label that's changed. And the experiences of being a person of color have had different themes in my life as well. So, Carmen, as we're thinking about our life and remembering and having our little coffee together, what are some of your thoughts about growing up in this current terminology, growing up Latinx, but what has that meant for you?
Yeah, so thanks, Richard. So, I feel for me, I'm originally from Texas, from El Paso. So I grew up in a border town. My mother was from Durango, and my father is from the Southwest. We have roots that span New Mexico and Texas. And so my father has some Native American roots. So it's interesting. I grew up fully bilingual, with a mother who spoke only Spanish, and a father who spoke English and Spanish, and a school where we were taught in English. So um, I think for me, being Mexican American or being Chicana has just been, it's what I've heard my whole life. Like I remember my father referring to himself as a Chicano, and my mother always identified as being Mexican because she came, she was born in Mexico. So I think for me, living on the border, I've been living in this, I grew up in this place where you're in America, but you're not necessarily American, and you're not necessarily Mexican, right? You're Mexican American. And so for me, it was always really clear. And I feel that the kind of marker for that for me was always the border, right? Because we lived with this border, which was the Rio Grande, right? Which kind of divided both sides of being American and being Mexican. And so it's kind of this dichotomy that I feel that I've grown up with, and studied as well, right? And looked at kind of Mexican American culture and border culture. But for me, it's really been, I feel it's just who I am. And I don't know how do I explain this? I feel like in terms of I guess there's been an evolution of consciousness, right? When you're a kid, you just are, right? You just kind of are, and your mother doesn't speak any English, so you speak Spanish to her and you speak English to her. And as you get older and you become more conscious of who you are and what it means, right? And what it is to navigate spaces, as
Right.
a Mexican American, whether you're in school, whether you're out in the community, has been a really interesting journey for me. And I feel like I didn't get to appreciate, I didn't appreciate it as much as I got older, got into college, really kind of got to learn so much because, they don't really teach you anything when you're growing up in elementary, middle school, high school, right? About about your culture. Your culture is a part of who you are and your daily experiences, right? But nobody tells you the real history of
Right.
our people. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been I feel like it's who I am, like in terms of my identity. I, identify as a Chicana, Latinx, Latina, however you want to say it. Like I feel like it's changed, woman of color.
Yeah.
Um, so
So so as you think about that journey, Carmen,
mhm,
you mentioned boundaries and borders,
mhm.
and in actuality or metaphorically, what have those borders or boundaries felt like as you've navigated being a Latina?
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like for me, there's been a lot of questions for me, right? Questions about myself, always for a long time feeling like, do I belong in this space? Do I belong in this environment? Am I good enough? Like, should I really be here? Right. And I think I remember growing up, my father, who worked for civil service and was in the army and worked at Fort Bliss for all his life until he retired, used to tell me, mija, don't ever let anybody believe that they're better than you or smarter than you, because they're not. And so I always held on to that, right? What my father told me. And that was what I brought in terms of my confidence, and like I had to believe that to be able to navigate those spaces. Otherwise, you kind of get eaten up or don't belong, right? Or you kind of you don't you it's difficult to navigate those spaces without that kind of confidence. And I think,
Right.
for me, it's been important to keep that in mind, even at times. And I think navigating white spaces has been difficult for me because I grew up on the border, and I grew up in a place where I was immersed by my culture every day, where there was no diversity, in my neighborhood, in my family. It was all Mexican American people, my community, my schools, everything. So it wasn't until I left Texas and I left El Paso that I began to really understand what true diversity was, right? Because even though I'm not a white person, right? It was just Latinos. That's all I knew for a very, very long time.
So there's an element of course, navigation
Mm-hmm.
and taking with you a certain amount of tools in your toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the key tools that your dad provided for your toolkit early on is that pride in who you are
Mm-hmm.
and how you carry yourself no matter what the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other tools, if you were, for example, talking to some Latinx students right now as they listen to this, what might be other tools that you would tell them would be helpful for navigating a dominant culture and dominant society?
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard. Thank you. I think I would say that never forgetting how valuable your experience is as a Latino or a Latina, right? And understanding the richness of our culture and how it enriches every space and environment that you go into. And I think also not being afraid to take up space. I think for Latinas especially, we're kind of taught, many times, to just kind of be quiet, be just kind of laid back, be humble. All of those things are great, right? But when you are navigating the professional world and the academic world, they don't necessarily serve you well, right? So I feel like culture is, it's a beautiful thing, but for women and for Latinas, it can also be something that really can hold us back and holds us down. So
Whoa.
I feel like really kind of, making, knowing, again, having that confidence about who you are, being able to take up that space, have a voice, right? Not being afraid to share your experiences, who you are, and just understanding and remembering that what you have to bring to the table is just as important as what anybody else is bringing to the table.
Yes, Carmen. Oh, it's beautiful. The what you just said is beautiful, but also there's a sadness in me too
Mm-hmm.
that speaks to being caught in the middle between cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes with a dominant culture, there's an expectation in order for us to survive, we have to give something up.
Mm-hmm.
We have to, like you said, there's certain qualities that we bring from
Mm-hmm.
our culture or a language that we bring from our culture. And the dominant culture can say in many different ways, and sometimes it's tacit, it's just invisible. But if you're going to be successful, you better be careful.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how might we still hold fast to that culture that's so dear to us while still navigating and knowing maybe the time and place to be culturally mindful of where we come from, and but yet still be honest with ourselves, like there's that caught in the middle aspect.
Mm-hmm. I feel like, I feel like it really, yeah, I feel like sometimes you have to, I feel like for me, right, I feel like there was a point in time where I realized like I something has to change for me, right? I need to have a different approach and mindset about who I am and what I bring. And I feel like at this juncture, um, that being able to navigate these spaces in academia, right? One, knowing, having the education, having the experience, knowing my discipline, right? Well, becoming an expert in my discipline is what has been for me, like, number one. Like, this is what I love to do. I love to be in service of people with disabilities and in service of humanity generally, right? And so what I bring in terms of culture and who I am and my lived experiences, I think only enriches my practice, and it helps me to better understand my students' experiences, the experiences of people with disabilities who come from marginalized communities, right? What are all of those things that we experience? I don't feel so much anymore like I have to. I feel like I'm careful in terms of, I'm maybe more conscious about knowing when spaces or conversations aren't friendly, or where people are not being, um what's the word, culturally competent,
Right.
right? And now feeling much more adept at calling that out in a way that is tempered, but in a way that also doesn't, I feel like we also have a responsibility, right? When we're working in academia or in any professional space, around when things happen to us, when we suspect that there is something that it just doesn't feel right, and maybe that it doesn't feel right because of who we are, right? Or
Mm.
the way that we hear something, or the way that we experience something that has happened is different than the way that somebody else would experience it. And I feel like it's okay to say it and to voice it. I feel like now I've learned how to do that better, right? How to bring that up, how to be able to talk about it and have conversations about it. And I'm going to say that oftentimes those conversations are uncomfortable for people, but I think that they're oftentimes very necessary to have.
Right. So those conversations, in order to go to a deeper level of understanding, are vital.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you also mentioned the importance of holding fast to our culture,
Mm-hmm.
but then also it's kind of like almost like a formula. I was thinking it sounds like a magic formula. Hold fast to the culture and be proud of it. Have a niche or niche where you know your content. And when you know your content and you know your culture and that's who you are, you can blend them together in order to bridge not only within your own culture, but the culture of others.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I feel like that's what makes me valuable and makes many other Latinas and Latinas very valuable, right? Is that we're not one dimensional, is that we're multidimensional in many ways, right? Professionally, personally, the way we bring our personal experiences into our professional work, the way
Mm.
that we're better able to serve our students because of these experiences, the way we can understand them better, the way that we're able to structure our practices, right? Even in terms of, for me as a director, is not looking at my students only through a lens of disability, but also looking at them through a lens of social justice and understanding many of their struggles, right? Because I've had some of those struggles, if not many of those struggles myself, as a woman of color or a
Mm.
person of color. So I think that yes, that it's a, I don't know that there's a magic formula. I think we have to find our own. We all are our own magic formula, right? Like we all like have to find what that formula is that works for us, wherever
So
we find ourselves. But again, we do have to compete, right? We've got to compete with everybody else. And so I'm going to say, like, know your stuff. Know what you, be passionate and love what you do and know it well.
know it well,
Mhm.
as you do. And we're so glad you're here at APU with us. Um, Speaking of APU, then I'll go. I started personal, but let's go organizational now. As we think about making, building bridges with others, you are one of the leaders in our new Affinity Mosaic
Mhm.
Association, the Latinx Faculty Staff Administrator Association. And from the outside looking in, some people might say, hey, wait a minute, they're just separating themselves from everyone else. And uh, but you know firsthand the importance of networking, and you know also firsthand, we're talking about it, the importance of culture and how culture enriches an organization. So what might you say to those at APU who are listening right now, uh, to let them know that Mosaic associations um, are very important to diversity, celebrating diversity, networking? What might you tell people that don't know about the Mosaic affinity organizations, why that's so important?
Yeah, I can speak for myself and why it's important to me, which is, it's important for me as a Latina to find community no matter where I go, whether it's at the university, whether it's in my own community, in my own neighborhood, in my own city. It's important for me to find community. It's important for me to find other people whom I can relate to on a cultural level. And in APU, it's the relating to them in a cultural and a professional level, right? And that for me helps me feel like I belong at APU.
Right.
It helps me feel like there is a place for me at APU. And for such a long time, Richard, people of color didn't have their own spaces. Like even universities were not built for people of color, right? Those spaces were never meant for us to be there.
Right.
And now we're here. And now it's important for us to carve out our own spaces as we navigate this still, um, this environment that is dominated not by us, right, but by whites, and that was built for white people. It's important for us to figure out how we can best navigate this environment, and how we can actually really help enrich the environment, how our lived experiences can enrich APU as a whole, and then really help bring us closer to our mission. Because and I say this a lot, is that diversity diversity is the essence of creation. And if that's true, then we should all be embracing diversity.
Diversity is the essence of creation. Okay, we're going to quote you on that one.
Okay.
Love that. Diversity is the essence of creation. Um, so, that being a given, diversity is the essence of creation. How might we communicate that, your quote,
Mhm.
to a broader community, that diversity is multifaceted
Mhm.
and that is God given? How
Mhm.
how how do we go about bringing everybody into that awareness and journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ways that we do it is by having our affinity groups, right? I know that we're just kind of beginning and starting some of these affinity groups, but as you see, some of the affinity groups are doing some really great work. Like this month, we have all these panels on the African American experience at APU, and those are amazing. Like I'm so looking forward to them. There's just, we need to be able to create these spaces where we can bring our culture to the campus community. And I think about this in terms of disability, in terms of our cultures, being a Latina, if it's your African American, but how do we bring this to the forefront? How do we help everybody understand the value of differences? And I believe that the way we do that is by raising the consciousness through knowledge and information about the value and the contributions of Latinx folks, of Black people, of people with disabilities, of whoever it is on campus. And I think another really important way of doing that is to ensure that that our campus represents the demographic of students that we serve. Because if our students don't see themselves in us, it's difficult for them to see themselves in positions of leadership and authority. And I can't tell you, Richard, how many times I've had Latino students walk into my office and look at me in disbelief that I'm the director. They're like, "Are you really the director?" Because they've never seen a Latino director at a university. Isn't that amazing? Like, and it still holds true today. And so when I see them, when I know that what the message that they're getting is that you can do it also.
Right.
If I'm here, you can do it too.
And doctora as well.
Yes. And it's been a long road, Richard. Like even for me, it took me a really long time to get finished with my education, right? Because a lot of it, because of culture, a lot of some of those constraints around culture and motherhood and the expectations that are kind of thrown upon us as Latinas. And so even in breaking away from those, it took me an extraordinarily long time to get to where I'm at in terms of my education. But you just keep pushing through because you know that it's something that you have to do. And so that's what I've done.
Yes, and very well too.
Thank you.
So as a concluding question, we've been talking about diversity and the tools for success, and diversity is multifaceted. I want to unpack that multifaceted aspect a little bit more because of your role with accessibility, with disability resources, because diversity is multifaceted, and part of our diversity is students with many different abilities. So how might we raise awareness? Once again, what might that raising awareness look like at APU to providing full access for all students, especially when we're talking about your particular Office of Accessibility and Disability Resources?
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard, and it's a very timely question because as we begin to work on our strategic plan and begin to look at different way of how we do things differently. We were all thrown into remote learning. People with disabilities have been fighting for remote access to spaces where they weren't remote. It's been frowned upon. Now the whole world has to go remote, and all of a sudden it's okay and it's doable, right? So there are lessons to be learned, right? Which are lessons around universal design of spaces. So universal design, I'm sitting on some committees right now where we're looking at how do we begin to implement the principles of universal design of learning and instruction in online pedagogies and curriculum development. And this is not just specific to people with disabilities. This is for all students. It is definitely something that benefits people with disabilities, but it's something that benefits all students, right? Different modalities to learn, different modalities of instruction and of teaching. And so now we've like been in this shipwreck. I always talk about COVID as being this massive shipwreck that kind of sunk us into the ocean. But then what happens in shipwrecks, you always find treasures, right? You always find things that are valuable. So for me, it's like pulling that out, right? What do we learn from this? And what can we take from the shipwreck? And what's been unearthed, and what do we see now, and how do we make this better? So for me, it's around really pushing that for the campus to ensure that everybody has access moving forward, because we're never going to be the same again after this pandemic, I don't think. And now we know what's possible. And so I'm excited about this kind of whole new change, or this whole new kind of evolution of thinking that people have been forced into, to think about accessibility and to think about access. And so I'm really hoping that as we move forward and we begin to develop online courses and even in-person courses, is that we begin to really look at those principles and really implement them within the curriculum, and even within student affairs, even within academic affairs, and non even spaces that are not classroom spaces, right? But how do we even access a service? How do students access our libraries? How do students access our groups, right? For student groups, etc. So that's something that's really exciting. So I'm excited to be a part of that change for APU. It makes me really happy to know that we're going in the right direction, and knowing that the university is behind ADR, and that I've got some really good support from student affairs to kind of to engage in this really important and critical work.
Well, we're blessed. We're blessed that you are with us at USA Pacific University. We're blessed that you are bringing cultural background and knowledge, mixing that and blending it with your expertise, and being hopeful for a future that we'll be realizing together. So thank you for your today and joining me in our Cafecito conversation.
Absolutely.
And
Thank you.
let's not make this the last time we get together. Still are praying for a time when we can actually run across the street to our little coffee shop and have a coffee in real time.
Yes, I look forward to it, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
God bless you, Carmen.
God bless you too.